So I promised that I would make a video about the history of the word California and the myth of California in European literature. So this story actually begins, at least for me, back in 2011. So in 2011, I was very interested in California literature. I had been reading a lot of 19th and 20th century writing from California, of which there's a lot. And I visited a museum in Santa Ana, California. And at the museum, they had a book that was the translation of several sections of a early 16th century manuscript by someone named Rodriguez de Montalvo. So his full name is Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo. So Montalvo was a writer of what's called Spanish romance. Now, when we hear romance, we think of like a novel about a man and a woman falling in love and a will they, won't they kind of thing. But romance, especially in the 14 and 1500s, usually meant a prose narrative that was fantastic. It wasn't a history. And usually it had to do with knights and heroes and their daring deeds. And often had a really wide scope, many adventures of a hero. In fact, during Montalvo's lifetime, there was a popular series of tales about Amadis of Gaul. These didn't originate with Montalvo, but he retold some of them. And then he added sort of some of his own further adventures of Amadis, and focused in these further adventures that he wrote about on Amadis and his son Esplandian. And so the text that I had stumbled across at this museum was from a book that Montalvo wrote called Las Sergas de Esplandian, or The Deeds or Adventures of Esplandian. And at the end of this text, as Esplandian is going around the world doing these daring deeds, Esplandian ends up in Constantinople. Now, it's important to kind of know some of the history of what's going on with Constantinople in the 1400s. In the 1400s, in 1453 in particular, historically speaking, Constantinople had been attacked by an army led by the Sultan Mehmet II. He was an Ottoman sultan, and he basically took over Constantinople for the Ottoman Islamic Empire. And it was the fall of a city that had lasted for, about 1,000 years. It was sort of one of the last Christian strongholds in that part of the world. So Montalvo, this would have happened within Montalvo's recent historical memory. And Montalvo in Las Sergas de Esplandian writes about an Islamic attack on the city. It's led by not the Sultan Mehmet, but a sort of coalition of sultans. But the sultans are defeated by Amadis and his son Esplandian and the Christian forces of Constantinople. So what does this have to do with California? Well, it's in Las Sergas de Esplandian that the word California is used for the first time in history. Because Montalvo, not sticking at all to historical facts, imagines that the sultans who are attacking Constantinople have called forth a range of armies and cultures from across the world to be their allies as they assault the Christian city. And Montalvo imagines that there's a group of Amazons who live in this far distant island called California. And they're led by a great queen, dark of skin, grim of appearance, a fell warrior, and her name is Calafia. Also, the Californians have a cavalry that rides griffins instead of horses. So they're very much like a fantasy army, as it were. All women, all Amazons. Now, curiously, in Greek and Roman mythology, Amazons came from, north of Greece, kind of in the Scythian regions, up near the Black Sea. Themyscira, made famous by the Wonder Woman movies, was supposed to have been a mythical city right up on the southern coast of the Black Sea. But Montalvo doesn't imagine that these are Amazons from that region of the world. He says they come from the island of California, which is near the Western Paradise. So basically, as far west as you can go, there's an island. It's ruled over by the great and majestic and terrifying Calafia and her band of Amazons who fly fantasy creatures and, are the terror of gods and men. Now, in La Sergas de Esplandian, there's sort of a kind of a subplot that involves Calafia shows up at Constantinople. She tries to help the sultans, and it goes well at first. Her Griffin cavalry is incredibly destructive to the Christian forces, but her griffins have been trained to eat men. And so they start eating the Christians who they're fighting against, but then they see the Sultan soldiers and try and eat them too. And, this kind of embarrasses Calafia, and she has to say, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for them to eat our allies. And so Calafia and one of the sultans decide, we'll challenge the Christians' greatest heroes to single combat. And so the Sultan challenges Esplandian to single combat, and Calafia challenges Amadis, Esplandian's father, who's getting up there in years and yet still can wield a sword. And so you have Calafia and the Sultan duel Amadis and Esplandian. And of course Amadis and Esplandian win. The Sultan is disgraced, but Calafia doesn't just lose and go home. She ends up kind of in this benevolent captivity in the city of Constantinople. She's tutored by Leonorina, who's the Christian princess of Constantinople, and she ends up converting to Christianity, and she's in love with Esplandian because he's the most dashing. But Esplandian's already engaged to Leonorina, and so Esplandian gives kind of one of his lower down knights. He's still nobility, but he's not, Esplandian. One of his sort of lesser knights, Talankay, he gives Talankay to Calafia to be her husband. And Talankay and his brother Minelli go with Calafia and her sister Leota back to California, and they have further adventures. The other interesting thing here is that the Age of Exploration takes place, in the generations after Montalvo writes. So a lot of the explorers to historically, geographically California would have known Montalvo's writings when they're sailing and, exploring in the mid to late 1500s. And so when the Spanish explorers get to Baja California, which appears to be an island, it turns out it's a long peninsula, they got there and said, this must be the California that Montalvo talked about. So the Spanish knew California in myth before they knew it in actuality. And I think it's an interesting question how the myths that we know about things shape our views of reality. And if we're going to establish, settlements, if we're going to establish new cities and cultures and cultural clashes that come with that, and we have a myth in our mind of what this place is or should be, how does that mythic, poetic understanding of ourselves and what we're doing inform and shape culture? Now, Calafia, it's interesting, is really part of California mythology, but not in a very robust way. Calafia shows up places. So I have this book that was given to me by a friend. It's called Calafia, and it's an anthology of poetry by California writers, especially the last 100 years. And on the cover, there's the seal of California. I'll show you. I'll probably put a picture up here, too. The seal of California has a queen on it, and it's supposed to be Calafia. If you go to Disneyland, if you go to Sacramento, if you go to sort of these important spots of art and culture in California, you'll often see art that depicts a dark-skinned regal queen in usually Amazonian war garb, sometimes more indigenous war garb. Different artists do different interpretations of her. So she's in California iconography, but few people know the original myth of California that's told by Esplandian, or that's told in the La Sergas de Esplandian by Montalvo. And so in 2013, I had been living in Europe for a number of years doing study at St. Andrews University in Scotland, and I decided to kind of do a retelling in poetry of the story of Calafia. And so I took this basic, Calafia shows up, she has a sister named Leota, they have a griffin steeds, there's a battle at the walls with the griffins. In Montalvo's narrative, Calafia duels a couple different Christians, first Norandel, and then she ends up dueling Amadis. But she ends up with Talankay. And I thought, I really want to amp up this romantic relationship between Talankay and Calafia. And so in my retelling, I ended up making Talankay kind of the main opponent turned friend turned husband of Calafia. I also thought that, it was a good chance to explore some of these questions of, Amazon's view of men is that we should train our griffins to eat them. Christians' view of men and women is very different than that. And so I thought it would be interesting to have this kind of clash of cultures and cultural expectation to explore ideas of feminism, which I'm interested in, of men and women and their relationship to each other, and also this idea of kind of this age where we're moving from the medieval to more of a Renaissance view. This story is kind of set there. I also, in my rewriting of it in 2013, I also wanted to make it a little bit more tragic in the Constantinople sequence. And so I basically do give a basic narrative of what actually happened in Constantinople, which is that the Sultan's forces are not rebuffed by the valiant Christians. They end up taking over the city, and it's a tragedy for the Christians. Many, many die. So in my retelling of the myth of California, I got to play with some of these themes, got to update and meditate on some of the big cultural issues that I think Californian culture and American culture faces through this very fantastic swashbuckling tale. So that's a little bit of the background of why I'm interested in the myth of California, why I've written the poem I did in Calafia, an Adventure. You can find online in public domain translations of the Calafia sections from Sergas de Esplandian. I'll put a link down in the description below so you too can go read this and think about it. I love this idea of mythic origins and exploring them in our present and seeing, where can we be informed by them, where maybe from our perspective can we critique them, but also how can we not be chronological snobs, in as much as sometimes we say, oh, it's old-fashioned, so it's all wrong. Maybe there's things that we can learn from meditating on the matter of California and the myths that surround its origin. Thanks for hanging out with us today. I hope this was helpful and kind of a little bit of a lesson in literary history. And if you want, you can check out my book, Calafia, an Adventure, and check out Montalvo's book as well. Thanks so much.